As you've already probably experienced, how many of you took the train ride right before this? Pretty much all of you, a few of you. How many of you taken the train ride after this? Okay. Well, as you're going, have or will experience, we are an active railroad. So why are we here? Well, we kind of had a little bit of good luck in that fortune. We're going to be going over that story here throughout the tour. That story begins all the way back in 1872 in the little tiny town called Mount Union. That's where our railroad began construction. And then it made its way 11 miles south through the Ogwick Valley, so named because of the Ogwick Creek. Yes, they really like reusing names here. Until they reached the west side of Blacklog Creek, across that creek from Orbisonia, in a little tiny town called Rock Hill Furnace. Now, Rock Hill Furnace was named for the Rock Hill family of iron masters, and they owned a bunch of little tiny family furnaces in the area. Those tiny family furnaces produced about 40 to 50 tons of iron a year. Pretty respectable for small little tiny family furnaces. However, they really wanted to expand this iron business, especially in 1873 when the railroad reached here. So they got together and took all the family furnaces and built one great big furnace, which you can see in the picture that's not behind me because they like changing the order on me. There it is. Great big furnace. It actually used to be right over there behind where the Rock Hill Trolley Museum is. And this great big furnace was going to produce 100 tons of iron a day. So pretty significant increase. And that significant increase kind of meant that, well, they needed a new fuel source. They've been using charcoal up until this point, but if they used charcoal for this iron furnace, they would log the whole mountainside in about 2 days and not have a whole lot of iron to show for it. The railroad knew that, though. Believe it or not, there was some pre-planning here. And they discovered, before the railroad began construction, that there was this very nice semi-bituminous coal vein up on Broad Top Mountain. Now, semi-bituminous coal, it's actually about halfway between bituminous and anthracite. Bituminous being soft coal, anthracite being hard coal. And semi-bituminous kind of had the best of both worlds. It burned very easily, like bituminous, but it burned very cleanly, like anthracite, making it very desirable. And as a result, our railroad continued construction from Orbisonia Rock Hill Furnace right here in 1873, all the way down this way through the towns of Pogue, Three Springs, and Saltillo, until it reached the base of the Broad Top Mountain and began climbing the east side of it. Wait a minute, East End Broad Top, that makes a good name for a railroad, doesn't it? Folks, that is how our railroad got its name, and it really is that simple. And we climbed the east side Broad Top Mountain at a 2.7% grade through a bunch of twisted curves and a few tunnels until we reached the towns of Robertsdale, Woodville, and Alvin in 1874. That's right, our main line only took 2 years to construct, perks of building it to a narrow gauge. Now, Robertsdale, Woodville, and Alvin, they were kind of the site of the coal. That's where the mines were. And you can kind of see the mines here behind me. In fact, that's tipple number 5 for mine number 5 that you see a picture of there. And that great big coal conveyor belt meant we took coal off the mountain, down here to the iron furnace, used it to make pig iron, and then took the pig iron another 11 miles that way back to Mount Union to send it out to the wider world. And this was a pretty darn good way of making money. But there was a little bit of foreshadowing during this time frame in our early history. And that foreshadowing came in the form of some of the coal not stopping here. In fact, the coal went all the way to Mount Union, at least some of it did, but it wasn't to go out to the wider world, not quite yet. It was for use in the 3 brick plants up in Mount Union. Many of you may know that Mount Union is known as a brick town. And up in that brick town, they had 3 brick plants that made a very special kind of brick. It was called fire brick. And if you know anything about fire brick, well, there's kind of 2 examples we tend to give. One, the brick that goes in a fireplace, and 2, if you know anything about steam locomotives, the brick that goes in the firebox of a steam locomotive. This fire brick wasn't for either of those. This fire brick was to be used in the blast furnaces of steel mills all the way out in Pittsburgh. So there's actually a little bit of irony to our story, and yes, the pun is definitely intended, because the railroad was partially responsible for the closure of the Rock Hill Iron Furnace in 1908. Why? People wanted steel. They didn't want iron anymore. Which meant we kind of had a problem. Our main way of making money was now gone. So the board of directors went, well, we really like making money. That's kind of why we started doing this. So Mr. Robert Siebert, operating vice president, we have a mission for you. We need you to get us making money again, and we would prefer that you did it quickly. Also, if you're at it, while you're at it, could you please modernize or fix the 40-year-old wooden freight cars that we have that are now starting to fall apart? That'd be awfully nice of you, sir. Don't worry, sir. We see the horrified look on your face. Here's a blank check to do it. That blank check actually really did help, because Mr. Siebert was responsible for the purchase of the 6 282 Mikado steam locomotives that you still see here on the property. And throughout our tour, you'll get to see 5 of them. Why 5? Well, you already saw 1. It's the front of the train. So that's 4 more. Additionally, he was responsible for the expansion of the shop complex we're going to see later on our tour. And he was responsible for the ordering and building of over 270 steel freight cars, many of which you see dotted around our rail yard still. And the construction of those freight cars happened right in the car shop next to the machine shop that we're going to be in today. Now, this expansion sounds like it took a lot of time, but it actually started pretty darn immediately, because the very first decision that Mr. Siebert made, and kind of saved our railroad, was instead of taking some of the coal to Mount Union for the brick plants, he was now going to take all of it. And the reason he was going to take all of it is he was going to send it out to the wider world. And to help facilitate that, in 1908, he built a great big coal washing plant. That coal washing plant, well, it sorted the coal by size, got all the debris and bony out of it, and put it in a standard gauge hopper to send it off where it needed to go. That whole process sounds quick, right? Well, guess what it was, especially for us, because our part of it was done in 30 seconds. That's how long it took to dump out a narrow gauge hopper. Once that happened, we could take that narrow gauge hopper and send it right back up the mountain to get more coal. There was still an issue though, and that issue was known as less than carload freight. Or to put it in a modern context, any of those packages you get delivered from FedEx, UPS, the Postal Service, or Amazon if you're so fortunate. Back in the days when our railroad was running regularly, we had this wonderful thing called the Sears and Roebuck catalog. And it had any number of things, from cookware to even houses you could build yourself out of a kit. And say you saw a sofa in that catalog that you really liked. So you would write to the catalog saying, I really want this sofa, here's the item number, here's the check to pay for it. And you would mail that off. And back in those days, you would wait a little bit. And you would wait a little bit more. And you would wait a little bit more. And if it was storming out, you'd probably wait a little bit more. Till eventually, you got a telegram saying, hey, your couch is at your local freight office, please pick it up. And you would come to a building such as the one we're in. And you would pull your horse and wagon up, or your pickup truck, depending on how much money you made, sign for your sofa, and take it on home. It was very much the Amazon Prime shipping of its day, but folks, as you can imagine, it did not take 2 days. And part of the reason for that was a 5-guy, 4-hour process in Mount Union that unloaded a standard gauge boxcar into 2 narrow gauge ones. Why? Well, since we were built to narrow gauge, our equipment was 3/4 the size, meaning our boxcars were not a 1-for-1 equivalent, so we needed 2 in order to get 1. Kind of a very inefficient process. This is where a little-known logging railroad enters our story. It actually inadvertently saves the day, because in 1924, the McKelvey Brothers Logging Company was logging Black Log Mountain back behind where the iron furnace used to be. And they were really good at their jobs. They were experts at logging. So much so that they very quickly realized that paying a crew of guys to hand transfer logs from a narrow gauge car to a standard gauge one, well, didn't really matter how many guys you had, it would take them all day to transfer 1 car of logs. Not efficient. So to solve that problem, they built a great big gantry structure right in the middle of the yard up there. And that gantry structure, well, it had a chain on it. And that chain, as you can see, would get wrapped around a bundle of logs, lifted on up off of the narrow gauge flat car, and transferred on over to the standard gauge one. This is where I have to warn you folks, that railroaders are very imaginative when it comes to naming things. This structure became known as the timber transfer. So named because it transferred timber from one car to another. When you take your train ride or you come back and take another train ride, be sure to ask our train crew why a Y is called a Y. They really love that question. Now, this worked really well for McKelvey. It worked so well, in fact, that 3 short years later, in 1927, they had run out of logs to log on Black Log Mountain, and probably went bust. So, well, kind of lamented that fact for half a minute, and then tore up their rails, took their little 2-truck narrow gauge shays, and went off to a different valley somewhere that way to go make more money. But they left the timber transfer behind because they couldn't really take it with them. And in 1933, our railroad realized that, hey, wait a minute, this structure is still there. And if we stiffen the structure, modernize a couple of the components, we can use it. Not to transfer logs anymore though, the lumber business was pretty well dried up. But instead, they were going to lift up one end of a standard gauge car, roll out the standard gauge truck, roll in the narrow gauge truck, set the car back down, do the same thing to the other side. And all of a sudden, that 5-guy, 4-hour process I mentioned earlier, now took 5 guys 30 minutes. And effectively converted the standard gauge car into a narrow gauge one. This actually single-handedly saved our less than carload freight business for the railroad. So much so that in 1939, we got a contract to take standard gauge cars of material out of what was known as the Shade Gap Branch. Now, the Trolley Museum actually runs on 2 miles of that right-of-way out to 522 in the Black Log Narrows. But it used to go further to its namesake town of Shade Gap. But even further south still, to a little tiny town called Neelyton. That's where these standard gauge cars were unloaded. And these standard gauge cars helped in the construction of a little known highway called the Pennsylvania Turnpike. What was a very much lucrative short-term game for our railroad ultimately helped in its demise. Why? Well, this newfangled thing called the Pennsylvania Turnpike brought with it more road traffic. More road traffic meant less people riding our passenger trains. So by 1954, our passenger business dried up. And by 1956, the coal business was following suit. Reason is, people have found this newfangled thing called oil. And we're using it to make gasoline and other heating products, and realized, hey, wait a minute, it's not as dusty and dirty as coal is. And it keeps our homes nice and warm, and in some cases it's cheaper. Hey, we'll take it. Well, as a result, that meant we had nowhere to go with the coal. And that meant in April of 1956, if you want the exact date, it's April 7th, we ran our last freight train. It was an empty hopper move pulled by number 17 out of the Mount Union Yard down here to Rock Hill Furnace. And that was the last freight move on our railroad. And, well, we were then sold to a scrap dealer. And if you know anything about railroads, that's usually the end of the story. But we're here today, and clearly the railroad's still here, which means there's a hero to our story. And I want to tell you about him, but I want to tell you about him on our way to the roundhouse. So folks, this is where I like to ask, are there any questions?
There were 2 standard gauge engines done by these jobs out of Mount Union. Did they have them built?
They were built by other companies and brought in, but they were ordered by these both companies. Any other questions?
Just curious, converting a standard gauge to a narrow gauge, how did the trucks fit?
Extra bolstery, but they actually fit pretty well. They had a universal kind of bolster plate. Yeah. Any other questions?
Why did they use narrow?
Cheaper.
Okay.
3/4 the size meant 3/4 the cost.
Is that because of the width of the
Yep.
track and the excavation? Or?
Excavation, we could take tighter corners, we could use sharper grades. Basically, we had less constraints on us when compared to a standard gauge railroad, meaning we had a lot more flexibility with how we spent our money.
The car.
It was also less. It was about 2 feet less. Any other questions? Well, seeing none, either you're all confused or I did a great job. But regardless of which one it is, this is where I'm going to ask you to stand on up and meet me down at the bottom of the steps here at the freight office.
link and pin demonstration.